Emma climbed the narrow woodland stairs to her grandfather's attic, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the small window. 6 months had passed since William had died, and she had avoided this room until now. Every corner held memories of the man who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was just 12 years old. The attic smelled like old books and lavender. Just like her grandfather always had, Emma wiped away a tear as she looked round at the boxes and furniture covered in white sheets. William had been more than a grandfather to her. He had been her best friend, her teacher, and the one person who always believed in her dreams. She started with a box near the window. Inside, she found his old reading glasses, some books about gardening, and a few photograph albums. Emma smiled as she flipped through pictures of family gatherings and holidays. Her grandfather always had a camera in his hand, capturing every important moment. As she moved deeper into the attic, Emma discovered an old wooden chest tucked away in the corner. The wood was dark and polished, with small metal hinges that creaked when she opened it. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper and faded photographs, her fingers touched something cold and metallic. She pulled out a small metal box, about the size of a shoebox, but much heavier. The box had a simple lock, but when Emma tried to open it, the lid lifted easily. Her grandfather had never locked anything away from her before, so she was curious about what he might have kept in this hidden container. Emma gasped when she looked inside. The box was filled with letters, dozens of them, all neatly stacked and tied with a blue ribbon. Each envelope was cream-colored and looked expensive. Like the kind people used for important occasions, all of the letters were addressed to the same person, James Parker, with an address in a town Emma had never heard of. What made her heart race was a simple detail that changed everything. Every single letter was sealed. None of them had ever been opened, which meant none of them had ever been sent. Her grandfather had written all these letters but had kept them hidden in this box for years. Emma's hand shook as she untied the ribbon and picked up the first letter. The date on the envelope was from 30 years ago, written in her grandfather's careful handwriting. She had always loved watching him write letters to friends and family. His penmanship was perfect, each letter formed with care and precision. She carefully opened the first envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink was still clear and dark. As she read the first few lines, Emma felt her world shift. Dear James, today marks 30 years since I made the biggest mistake of my life. I don't know if you're still alive, or if you'd even want to hear from me, but I write to you anyway, because some burdens are too heavy to carry alone. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she continued reading. The letter talked about guilt and regret, about nightmares that wouldn't go away, and about a friendship that had been broken by fear. Her grandfather wrote about missing someone terribly and wishing he could turn back time to make different choices. She had never seen this side of William before. To Emma, he had always been the strongest person she knew. He was the one who comforted her when she cried, who helped her with homework, and who taught her how to ride a bicycle and drive a car. He was patient and kind, always ready with a joke or a story to make her feel better. But this letter revealed a different man, someone who carried deep pain and regret. Someone who had been writing to a friend for 30 years but had never found the courage to send even one letter. Emma wondered who James Parker was and what had happened between him and her grandfather all those years ago. She opened another letter, this one dated 5 years later. In it, William wrote about getting married to Emma's grandmother, Lucy. He told James about the wedding ceremony and how he wished his old friend could have been there. The letter was filled with happiness, but also sadness, as if William felt guilty for being happy when James might not be. Emma opened letter after letter, each one revealing more pieces of a story she never knew existed. William wrote about the birth of Emma's mother, about buying his first house, about learning to be a father, and about all the big and small moments of his life. But in every letter, there was an underlying sadness, a wish that things could have been different. As the afternoon sun began to set, Emma realized she was holding the key to understanding her grandfather's life in a completely new way. She finally understood why he sometimes looked sad even when he was smiling, why he always talked about the importance of courage and facing your fears, and why he had taught her that it was never too late to make things right. Emma wiped her tears and looked at the box full of letters. She made a decision that would change everything. She would find James Parker. Wherever he was, she would deliver these letters that her grandfather never had the courage to send. Even though William was gone, she could help him find the peace he had been searching for his entire life. Emma sat on her grandfather's old leather chair in the living room, the box of letters beside her on the small wooden table. The house felt quieter than usual as she arranged the letters by date. Starting with the oldest ones, she wanted to understand the story from the beginning, to learn about the secret her grandfather had kept hidden for so many years. The first few letters were harder to read because the ink had faded, but Emma could still make out most of the words. As she read each one carefully, his story began to unfold that she had never heard before. Her grandfather William had been a soldier when he was very young, just 20 years old, serving his country far away from home during a terrible war. Emma had known that William served in the army, but he rarely talked about those days. When she asked him questions as a child, he would change the subject or tell her stories about the friends he made instead of talking about the fighting. Now she understood why those memories were too painful to share. In the early letters, William wrote about meeting James Parker at the army base. They had become friends immediately, both young men scared and homesick, missing their families and wondering if they would ever see home again. William described James as someone with a quick smile and a generous heart, always sharing his food with soldiers who had less, always ready to help anyone who needed it. The two young men had promised to look after each other. They shared everything: their fears about the war, their dreams about what they wanted to do when they returned home, and their memories of the people he loved. William wrote that James felt like the brother he never had, someone he could trust completely in a world that felt dangerous and uncertain. Emma paused in her reading to make a cup of tea, the same kind her grandfather always drank in the evenings. As she waited for the water to boil, she thought about how young William must have been, barely older than she was now, trying to be brave in a situation that would frighten anyone. She returned to the letters and continued reading. The story took a dark turn when William wrote about a night that changed everything. Their army base had come under attack from enemy soldiers. It was William's job to keep watch while James got some much-needed sleep. The two friends had been taking turns watching over their position, making sure they were safe from surprise attacks. But when the shooting started, William wrote, he had made a terrible mistake. Instead of staying at his post and waking James like he was supposed to do, he panicked. The sound of gunfire and explosions terrified him so much that he ran away to find help. Leaving James alone and unprotected, Emma's heart broke as she read her grandfather's description of what happened. Next, by the time William came back with other soldiers to help, James had been badly hurt. Enemy soldiers had found him sleeping and defenseless. James was unconscious and bleeding. with injuries that the army doctors said would affect him for the rest of his life. The worst part, William wrote, was that he never got the chance to explain what happened or to say he was sorry. The army moved William to a different unit the next day, and he never saw James again. He left his best friend lying in a hospital bed, not knowing if James would live or die, not knowing if James would ever understand why William had left him alone. Letter after letter revealed how this one night had haunted William for the rest of his life. He wrote about nightmares that woke him up screaming, about jumping every time he heard a loud noise, and about feeling guilty whenever good things happened to him. Emma realized that her grandfather had been suffering from what people now call trauma. But back then, soldiers were expected to be strong and silent about their pain. As Emma read more letters, she learned about her grandmother Lucy through William's eyes. He wrote to James about meeting her at a dance, about how beautiful and kind she was, and about how lucky he felt to have found love. But even in his happiest letters, William wrote that he wished James could have been there to celebrate with them. William described his wedding day to James in great detail, talking about the flowers Lucy carried, the music they danced to, and the friends and family who came to celebrate. But he also wrote about feeling sad during the ceremony, wondering where James was and if he had recovered from his injuries. When Emma's mother was born, William wrote a letter to James filled with joy and wonder about becoming a father. He described holding his tiny daughter for the first time and making promises to be the best father he could be. But even then, he told James that he wondered if his friend had children of his own and if James had found happiness despite everything that happened. Emma wiped tears from her eyes as she read the final letters from this period. Her grandfather had spent decades writing to his friend, sharing every important moment of his life with someone who would never read the words. William had carried the weight of his guilt alone, believing that he was a coward who had failed the person who trusted him most. As the evening grew dark outside, Emma understood her grandfather in a completely new way. The man who had taught her about courage and doing the right thing had spent his whole life believing he was neither brave nor good. She felt sad for the young soldier who made one mistake and carried the burden of it forever. Emma tossed and turned in her bed all night, unable to stop thinking about the letters she had read. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw images of her young grandfather running away in fear, leaving his best friend behind. She kept wondering what had happened to James Parker and whether he was still alive somewhere, never knowing that William had spent 40 years writing to him. When the sun came up, Emma knew she could not go to work that day. She called her boss at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade and explained that she was not feeling well. It was not exactly a lie because her heart felt heavy with sadness for her grandfather. She needed time to figure out how to find James Parker. Emma made herself a cup of coffee and sat down at her kitchen table with a laptop computer. She opened the internet and typed James Parker into the search box. Immediately, hundreds of results appeared on her screen. There were James Parkers who were doctors, teachers, business owners, and retired people. Some were young, some were old, but none of them seemed to match the person her grandfather had written about. She tried adding words like veteran and army to her search, hoping to narrow down the results. She found several James Parkers who had served in the military, but most of them were either too young or had served in different wars. Emma spent hours clicking on different websites, reading about people with the same name, but none of them felt right. Next, Emma tried searching on websites for veterans and military organizations. She created accounts on several sites and posted messages asking if anyone knew a James Parker who had served in the same unit as her grandfather. She included the dates and location she had found in the letters, hoping someone might recognize the information. After spending the entire morning on the computer with no success, Emma decided to visit the public library. She had always loved the library as a child, and Mrs. Thompson, the head librarian, had helped her with school projects many times over the years. Mrs. Thompson was a woman in her 60s with grey hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had worked at the library for over 30 years and seemed to know how to find information about almost anything. When Emma explained her situation, Mrs. Thompson's face filled with sympathy and determination. Together, they spent the afternoon searching through old phone directories that the library kept in storage. They looked for James Parker in phone books from different states and different years, hoping to find some trace of him. Mrs. Thompson also showed Emma how to use the library's newspaper archives, where they could search through old articles and announcements. They found a few promising leads. There was a James Parker who had been mentioned in a newspaper article about a veterans' parade in 1995, and another James Parker who had won a community service award in a small-town newspaper. Emma called the phone numbers listed in the old directories, but most of them were no longer working. The few people who answered the phone were either the wrong James Parker or had never heard of the person she was looking for. Days passed, and Emma's search became more desperate. She took time off work to make phone calls during business hours. She contacted veterans' hospitals in 5 different states, explaining her story to nurses and social workers who might have records of patients named James Parker. She called retirement homes and assisted living facilities, hoping that someone might remember a resident with that name. Most of the people Emma spoke with were kind and wanted to help, but they had strict rules about protecting the privacy of their patients and residents. Some facilities would not give out any information at all, while others promised to pass along Emma's message if they had a James Parker living there. Emma also tried contacting military record officers, but she learned that many older records had been lost or damaged over the years. Without knowing James Parker's exact service number or other specific details, it was almost impossible to track down his military information. After 2 weeks of searching, Emma felt ready to give up. She had called dozens of places, searched through hundreds of websites, and followed every lead she could find. Her hope was fading, and she wondered if James Parker might have died years ago, taking the chance for her grandfather's apology with him. Then, on a quiet evening while she was rereading some of her grandfather's letters, Emma noticed something she had missed before. In one of the early letters, William had mentioned that James came from a small town called Millfield. He had written about James talking about his hometown, describing it as a place where everybody knew everybody else and people looked out for their neighbors. Emma had never heard of Millfield before, but she immediately searched for it online. She discovered that it was a tiny town about 300 miles from where she lived. The town's website showed pictures of a single main street with a few small shops, a post office, and what looked like a very peaceful community. According to the website, fewer than 2,000 people lived in Millfield. Emma remembered something her grandfather used to say about small towns. In places like that, people remember each other for generations. She realized that if James Parker had really grown up in Millfield, there might be people there who remembered him or his family, even if he had moved away long ago. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a spark of real hope. She decided to pack the letters in her car and drive to Millfield. It would take 6 hours to get there, but she was determined to find someone who knew James Parker. Emma woke up early on Saturday morning, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. She had packed her car the night before with the box of letters, a small overnight bag, and snacks for the long drive to Millfield. She had barely slept, thinking about what she might discover in the small town where James Parker had grown up. The drive took her through beautiful countryside, past rolling hills and small farms. Emma tried to imagine her grandfather and James as young men, probably driving through similar landscapes when they went home on leave from the army. She wondered if they had talked about their hometowns and shared stories about the places they missed. As Emma got closer to Millfield, the roads became smaller and quieter. She passed fewer cars and saw more open fields with cows and horses grazing peacefully. The morning sun was warm and bright, making everything look golden and peaceful. It was the kind of place that seemed far away from the troubles of the world. When Emma finally reached Millfield, she was struck by how small and charming it looked. The main street was only about 4 blocks long, with old brick buildings that looked like they had been there for 100 years. There were flower boxes in the windows and American flags hanging from several of the shops. A few elderly people were walking slowly down the sidewalks, stopping to chat with each other like old friends. Emma parked her car near a small cafe with a hand-painted sign that read Betty's Kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon drifted out through the open door, making her stomach crumble. She had been too nervous to eat breakfast that morning, but now she realized she needed food and coffee to give her courage for what she was about to do. When Emma walked into the cafe, she immediately felt welcomed. The walls were covered with photographs of local families and events from over the years. There were about a dozen small tables with red checkered tablecloths, and soft country music was playing in the background. Several customers were eating breakfast and reading newspapers, talking quietly among themselves. Behind the counter stood a woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a cheerful yellow apron and had laugh lines round her eyes that suggested she smiled often. When she saw Emma, she wiped her hands on her apron and came over with a warm smile. "Good morning, honey," the woman said. "You're not from round here, are you? I'm Betty, and this is my place. What can I get for you?" Emma ordered coffee and a piece of homemade apple pie, then took a deep breath. "Actually, Betty, I'm hoping you might be able to help me with something. I'm looking for someone who used to live here a long time ago. His name is James Parker." Betty's eyes widened and her whole face changed. She looked surprised and delighted at the same time. "Jimmy Parker? Oh my goodness gracious, I haven't heard that name in years and years. Jimmy Parker lived here with his parents and his sister when I was just a young woman starting this cafe." Emma's heart started beating so fast she thought Betty might be able to hear it. "You actually knew him? You remember him?" Betty nodded enthusiastically and sat down at Emma's table. "Of course I remember Jimmy. He was such a sweet boy, always polite and helpful. His family lived in the White House at the end of Maple Street. Jimmy was a few years older than me, but everyone in town knew him because he was always doing nice things for people. He would help elderly neighbors with their yard work, and he delivered groceries for people who couldn't get to the store themselves." Emma felt tears starting to form in her eyes. This was the same James Parker her grandfather had written about, the kind and generous young man who had been William's best friend in the army. Betty continued talking, her voice becoming more serious. "Jimmy went off to join the army when he was just 19 years old. His parents were so proud of him, and the whole town had a little party before he left. We all expected him to come back in a year or two and maybe take over his father's hardware store." Emma leaned forward, hanging on every word. "What happened when he came back?" Betty's expression grew sad. "Well, that's the heartbreaking part of the story. Jimmy did come back, but he was very different. He had been hurt badly in the war, and he needed a lot of medical care. His legs were injured, and he had trouble walking. but it wasn't just his body that was hurt. Jamie seemed scared and sad all the time. He didn't want to see his old friends, or go to church, or do any of the things he used to love. Emma felt her heart breaking for James, understanding now how much both men had suffered. From that terrible night so long ago, Betty shook her head sadly. His poor parents tried everything they could think of to help him feel better. They took him to doctors in the city and tried to make him feel comfortable at home. But after a few years, the family decided to move away from Millfield. I think they thought a change of scenery might help Jimmy heal. Emma felt her hope beginning to fade. If James had moved away 30 years ago, how would she ever find him now? But Betty was not finished with her story. "Wait right here, dear," she said, standing up quickly. "Let me call my friend Margaret. She lives just down the street. And she has an amazing memory for keeping track of everyone who ever lived in this town, if anyone knows what happened to Jimmy Parker after his family moved away. It would be Margaret." Emma drove slowly into the parking lot of Sunshine Manor, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The care home was a beautiful building with red brick walls and large windows surrounded by PT gardens. She could see elderly residents sitting on benches in the sunshine, some reading books and others chatting with visitors. Her heart was beating so fast she wondered if she might be making a mistake. But she knew she had to finish what she had started. She sat in her car for a few minutes, holding the box of letters on her lap. Emma thought about her grandfather and how proud he would be that she had come this far. She whispered a little prayer asking for courage and stepped out of the car. The front entrance of Sunshine Manor had automatic glass doors that opened as Emma approached. Inside, the building smelled like flowers and cleaning supplies, and soft music was playing from speakers in the ceiling. The walls were painted in cheerful colors, and there were photographs of residents and their families displayed. On bulletin boards at the front desk sat a young man who looked to be about Emma's age. He had kind eyes and a friendly smile, and his name tag said David. When Emma approached the desk, David looked up from his computer and greeted her warmly. Emma took a deep breath and began to explain why she was there. She told David about finding the letters in her grandfather's attic, about learning the story of William and James, and about her search that had led her to this place. As she spoke, David's expression changed from polite interest to amazement, and then to something that looked like excitement. "That's incredible," David said when Emma finished her story. "Mr. Parker is going to be so surprised. He's been living here for about 5 years now, and he doesn't get many visitors except for his sister who comes every Sunday." David stood up and came round from behind the desk. "Mr. Parker spends most of his time in our garden," he explained, as he led Emma through the building. "He's 89 years old now, and he uses a wheelchair to get round, but his mind is as sharp as anyone's. He loves to read and tell stories about the old days. I think he's going to be very happy to meet you." They walked through hallways decorated with artwork made by the residents and past a dining room where some people were playing cards and board games. Emma could hear laughter and conversation, and she was relieved to see that Sunshine Manor seemed like a pleasant place where people were well cared for. The garden was even more beautiful than Emma had expected. There were flower beds full of roses and daisies, a small pond with goldfish swimming in it, and several large oak trees that provided shade for benches and tables under the biggest oak tree. An elderly man sat in a wheelchair with a book open. In his lap, James Parker had white hair and wore a light blue cardigan sweater. His face was wrinkled, but his eyes were bright and alert. His hands, resting on the book, looked like they had done a lifetime of hard work. Even though he was much older now, Emma could see traces of the young man her grandfather had described in his letters. David approached James carefully and spoke in a gentle voice. "Mr. Parker, this young lady has traveled a very long way to see you. Her name is Emma, and she has something very special to tell you about her grandfather, William Davies." When James heard William's name, his entire body seemed to freeze. He looked up at Emma with wide eyes that quickly filled with tears. His mouth opened as if he wanted to speak. But no words came out at first. "William Davies," James finally whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "My dear friend William. Is he? How is he?" Emma sat down on a chair next to James's wheelchair and spoke as gently as she could. "I'm sorry to tell you that my grandfather passed away 6 months ago, but before he died, he left something for you. Actually, he left many things for you." Emma opened the box of letters and showed them to James. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch the envelopes, and tears began to roll down his cheeks. "He wrote to me?" James asked in amazement. His voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded. "He wrote to you for 40 years. He never forgot about you, James. He never stopped thinking about what happened that night during the war, and he never stopped wishing he could tell you how sorry he was." James held the first letter carefully, as if it were made of the most delicate glass. "May I read them?" he asked. Emma and James spent the rest of the afternoon reading through the letters together. James would read parts of some letters out loud, sometimes laughing at memories of their time together as young soldiers, and sometimes crying at the pain and guilt that William had carried for so many decades. He didn't need to feel guilty, James kept saying as they read. "We were just boys, scared and far from home. William did what any frightened young man might have done. I never blamed him for what happened, not for a single day." James told Emma about his own life after the war. Despite his injuries, he had married a wonderful woman named Helen and raised 3 children who had given him 8 grandchildren. He had worked as a school teacher for 35 years and had lived a happy, meaningful life.